Bombs blew houses to rubble. People cooked alive. Monsters did unspeakable things to innocent women and children. Hundreds of cities and their people suffered terribly in the Second World War, though some far more than others. In this video, we're going to give you an overview of 8 cities which we think were the most dangerous, terrifying cities you could have lived in during the Second World War. The Philippines had it rough in World War II, and this was especially true for its capital city, Manila. Just 10 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese invasion of the Philippine Islands began. Allied forces defending the Philippine Islands were forced to flee, leaving them to suffer a 3-year Japanese occupation, in which time Japanese soldiers committed innumerable atrocities. It wasn't until the Allies returned, under the command of General MacArthur, however, that the Japanese took their atrocities to unprecedented levels. During the 1945 Battle of Manila, thousands of Filipino and American troops perished, yes, but in just the month for which that battle raged, the Japanese murdered some 100,000 civilians in the most brutal of ways. Women and children were shot, bayoneted, decapitated, and set on fire. Some were used as human shields and then murdered. Others survived only to live the rest of their lives with horrible mutilations. Women and young girls were herded into designated buildings in which the Japanese raped them in groups and then killed them. The city itself saw some of the fiercest urban combat in all the war and in all of history, and it was utterly laid to waste by Japanese and American shells. While it's largely agreed that the Germans started the Second World War, the devastation wrought upon some German cities was criminal. The city of Hamburg, vital to German industry, was repeatedly hit by Allied bombers throughout the war, but they dealt a truly crippling blow to the city in July 1943, during an operation codenamed Gomorrah. Flying side by side, British Royal Air Force and United States Army Air Forces rained hellfire on Hamburg, inciting a firestorm which melted as many as 58,000 civilians to the bone and wounded a further 180,000. The flames were so intense that they birthed a 460-meter high fire tornado which tore through the city at a temperature of 815 degrees Celsius. The 40,000 odd firemen in the area didn't stand a chance, and when the fires finally went out, some 200 major factories and 4,000 lesser factories had been destroyed, truly decimating the city's industrial output. And the Allies weren't finished yet. They bombed Hamburg a further 69 times before the end of the war. We can't mention firestorms without heeding the German riverside city of Dresden, whose story was a little different from Hamburg's. While Hamburg was an industrial powerhouse, Dresden was a city of culture, known throughout the war for its arts and beautiful Gothic architecture. The Allies arranged the city's ruin primarily to crush German morale, and in this they succeeded, but at what cost? The answer is some 25,000 civilians, of whom a great many were roasted alive in their homes and bomb shelters as an Allied firestorm roared through Dresden in February 1945. Some 78,000 residential dwellings were burnt to the ground, while a further 27,700 were left uninhabitable, and 64,500 were otherwise damaged. To hit the message home, more than 90% of Dresden's city centre was obliterated. All of this is especially terrible because the people of Dresden believed the Allies would never target the city, for it simply wasn't a militarily viable target. This turned out to be a fatal miscalculation. Like Hamburg, Germany's capital city Berlin was bombed by the Allies all throughout World War II, with the British alone dropping more than 45,500 tons of explosives on it. All in all, 16 square kilometers of the city was pulverized and about a third of all its houses were rendered uninhabitable. By May 1945, about 40% of Berlin's population had fled in fear of their lives. That's 1.7 million people. When the Red Army finally brought the fight back to Berlin and ended the war in Europe, They unleashed some 40,000 tons of explosives on the German capital in just 2 weeks. What happened when the Red Army split into the city was about as atrocious as what the Japanese did in Manila. The Soviets slew some 125,000 civilians in Berlin, supposedly taking revenge on the Germans who had done the same to their women and children. In reality, it was German women and children, not German soldiers, whom the Soviets raped and murdered. And they truly tainted the great victory they worked so hard to achieve. Poland's capital, Warsaw, took the full brunt of Germany from the beginning of World War II to the end of the war in Europe. The city itself was quite literally demolished, with 85% to 90% of it turned to dust by the end of the war. It started with the bombing of Warsaw in the 1939 invasion of Poland and ended, mostly, with Germany's systematic demolition of the city toward the end of 1944, which was set in motion to create more German living space and also in retaliation to the Polish resistance's Warsaw Uprising. Between 1939 and the end of the war in Europe, Warsaw was also home to the largest Nazi ghetto of World War II, in which hundreds of thousands of Jews were imprisoned, some 460,000 at its peak. These poor human beings virtually slept on top of each other, and as many as 92,000 Jews perished inside the ghetto as a result of starvation, disease, the Warsaw Uprising, and the city's systematic demolition. Some 300,000 residents of the Warsaw Ghetto were sent to concentration camps, where they all became victims of the Holocaust. To put this into perspective, only 6% of Warsaw's population was left in the city at the war's end. That's right, 6%. When you think of ruined Japanese cities, you likely think of the two cities hit with the nuclear warheads in the final days of the Second World War. The Japanese capital city of Tokyo, however, was firebombed by the B-29s of the United States Army Air Forces all throughout 1944 and 1945, and also subjected to the single most destructive aerial raid of all time, Operation Meeting House. All in all, the Americans razed 41 square kilometers of central Tokyo to the ground, ended the lives of up to 130,000 civilians, and left 1 million people without homes. More than 267,000 buildings were destroyed and the city's industrial output was slashed in half. In Operation Meeting House, conducted on the 9th and 10th of March 1945, the USAAF flew over Tokyo with 269 B-29s and murdered up to 100,000 Japanese civilians, accounting for more than 76% of the civilians killed across all the strategic bombings of Tokyo. Up to 1 million more were wounded, and some consider the operation, like the firebombing of Dresden and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to have been a war crime. Of course, we now have Hiroshima and Nagasaki, two Japanese cities which maintain the title of being the only cities on Earth to have tasted the wrath of an atomic bomb. For this reason, we've clumped them together. Before the August 1945 bombings, in which the USAAF deployed the nuclear warheads Little Boy and Fat Man, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were thriving, but on the 6th and 9th of that month, they were reduced to radioactive dust bowls. Up to 126,000 civilians were killed in the first atomic blast, and up to 80,000 were killed in the second, for a total of 226,000 deaths. While the blasts instantaneously turned many people to ash, it was the after effects which would have made living in Hiroshima and Nagasaki so terrifying. Many survived but were horribly burnt, and many suffered from radiation-related sicknesses, which, assuming they didn't die a slow, agonizing death before they could procreate, could be passed down through the generations. The fires birthed by the first bomb spread 13 square kilometers and destroyed 63% of Hiroshima's buildings. In contrast, just under 23% of Nagasaki's buildings were destroyed. The German siege of Leningrad, lasting 2 years and 4 months between September 1941 and January 1944, remains the longest and most devastating siege in human history, and as such, Leningrad wins as our most dangerous, terrifying city to live in during the Second World War. It is estimated that up to 1 million Soviet civilians perished during the siege or while trying to flee it. In total, 1.4 million were successfully evacuated. On top of living each day in fear of being torn apart by German shells, the people of Leningrad suffered from extreme starvation and got it so bad that thousands resorted to cannibalism. There were so many corpses that there was no choice but to leave them in piles in the street, piles which froze solid in the biting Russian winter. The city itself wasn't quite as devastated as some of the others we've mentioned so far, with just 16% of its houses being destroyed by German bombs and guns, though the Germans also severed all public utilities, like water and electricity, making the city of Leningrad truly inhospitable. But what do you think? Do you agree with our assessment that Leningrad was the most dangerous, or at least the most terrifying city to live in during the Second World War? Or would that still have been Los Angeles? Please share your thoughts in the comment section below. And just before you go guys, if you want to check out our wider history community, make sure you join us on Discord where you can chat to myself and other history buffs. And if you want to listen to the music we play in our videos unobstructed, do check out our Relax Jack music channel. You can use the music for your own creative projects too. And if you want access to exclusive content you won't find on this YouTube channel, do check out our Patreon and our Instagram and Facebook. Anyways guys, as always, thank you so much for watching and I hope you learned something new.